Hi, this is Professor Unmack, and I put together this short video to highlight a couple of things that I want you to know about interest groups. This is intended to complement the material that's in your textbook and also in the videos, the other videos that I assigned for you to watch. When we talk about interest groups in political science, we're really reflecting on a political theory called pluralism. And what pluralism suggests is that the way policymaking gets done, in other words, the way laws get passed, the way politicians get motivated to get things done, is that they respond to the demands of organized groups. This is a positive theory in the sense that it suggests that anybody who is willing to take the time and energy to organize with others to try to get something done can have a voice in the political process. It's got some downsides to it, though. What happens if a group is difficult to mobilize? What if a group has a real concern, but they can't mobilize as easily as other groups can? How does their voice get heard in the political process? So I want to talk a little bit about some of the positive aspects of interest groups, but also end the video with some of the concerns that political scientists have about politicians responding primarily to the demands of organized interests and what sorts of groups get left out of that process. So I want to start by showing you this slide. So this slide just is some pictures that I found on the internet that are the kind of public face of interest groups. If you think about protests and marches and that aspect of people coming together to demand change from their government, whether it's groups on the far right or groups on the left, or people fighting for women's rights, or people fighting for racial equality, that kind of thing. That's the sort of public face of interest groups, but interest groups do a lot more than that. And a lot of what interest groups do that really affects the policy-making process is done behind the scenes, and we don't really see it play out in our everyday lives. I want to start by talking a little bit about why interest groups form. And there are a lot of theories out there about why interest groups form. The one that I find the most persuasive and I find the most logical is a theory called disturbance theory. It's referenced a little bit in your textbook. It was first put forward back in the 1950s by a political scientist named David Truman. And what Truman argues is that every person is actually potentially part of the political environment. What gets us from being potentially mobilized to being mobilized and to being willing to put our time and energy and sometimes our money into joining or even forming an interest group is some sort of threat, either a real or perceived threat. And so what Truman argues, and this is why it's called disturbance theory, is that when we're living our everyday ordinary lives, our plates are full of particular things. We go to school, we hang out with our friends, we maybe have a job that we go to, we're paying our bills, we're worried about XYZ, and we won't spontaneously join or form an interest group unless we perceive that there's a reason to do so. And usually that comes in the form of a threat. So for example, if you live in a neighborhood and you don't currently belong to a neighborhood watch group, or you don't currently have a neighborhood watch group in your neighborhood, but then all of a sudden there's a series of break-ins or a bunch of cars get broken into, and there's a perception in the neighborhood that things are getting dangerous. That's the kind of thing that might mobilize people to form a neighborhood watch group or to get together with their neighbors and go to invite the police to come and talk to their neighborhood group or something like that. Or something like a new development that gets planned. Let's say you live in a neighborhood and there's a vacant field behind your neighborhood, and all of a sudden you find out that, I don't know, somebody's planning on building a nuclear waste dump or something in the vacant field. That's going to be the kind of thing that sends shockwaves through the neighborhood, and it's going to, according to disturbance theory, it's going to motivate people to join or form a neighborhood association, save our fabulous neighborhood from nuclear waste dumps. And that's disturbance theory. An example of that, that's a fairly recent entry into the interest group environment, is this organization called Everytown. Everytown is a pro-gun control organization that started after the Sandy Hook shooting. So it hasn't been around for all that long, but you can imagine that if people feel that their schools or their children are under threat from gun violence, instead of just making your voice known by calling a member of Congress or writing a letter to the editor of the newspaper or posting something on your blog or Twitter or something like that, people band together and make their voices more powerful by joining forces in the form of an interest group. This is just one. There's lots of other interest groups out there, but this is kind of a recent one I thought I'd give you as an example. And interest groups actually perform some positive functions in terms of linking us with our government. Interest groups are one of what we call linkage institutions. So are political parties, so are voting. Voting in elections is also a way that we get linked with our government. Some of the positive functions of interest groups, these are referenced a little bit in your textbook. I'll maybe say them in a slightly different way. So hopefully by the time you've watched this video and read the textbook, you'll have a good idea about what these positive functions of interest groups are. The first is what your book refers to as a purposive benefit, but I like to think of as a sort of representative function of interest groups. And what interest groups do is they give people who share a common purpose or a common goal a way to maximize the impact that their efforts have. Interest groups do this in a lot of ways. Sometimes they represent our interests when we're not even paying attention. So, for example, interest groups do a lot of lobbying. A lobbyist is a person who makes their living representing an interest group in the political agenda. I actually used to be a lobbyist for an organization within the CSU system, and I lobbied the state of California on higher education issues. I did that for a couple of years before I went to grad school. Lobbying is big business. Lobbying is actually also a regulated industry. This is a website called opensecrets.org, and one of the things that Open Secrets does is it collects information about how much and how money is being spent in the political arena, and one of their databases has to do with lobbying. And I like this graphic because you can see from the last 20 years or so, last 20 years or so, just how many people make their living lobbying they get paid to be a lobbyist, and also how much money is spent by special interest groups on lobbying. And you can see that in the last year or so, that number is well over $3 billion. That's not money spent on campaign contributions and that kind of thing. That's money specifically spent in the political arena by organizations to try to influence the decision-making of politicians. Almost every interest you can think of has an interest group associated with it, and those interest groups hire lobbyists. Obviously, interest groups that have more money can hire more and better lobbyists, which makes their voice heard somewhat more readily in the political process. And that can be a concern of people who belong to organizations that don't have a lot of money, for example. Another way that interest groups can represent the purposive goals of the groups, of the people that they represent in their groups, is through legal challenges. One of the things that interest groups can do is they can sponsor people to challenge laws that they find are unjust or that they think are unconstitutional or that they just think are bad laws. It's really expensive to file lawsuits and to go through the legal process. It costs a lot of money to write briefs. It costs a lot of money to hire lawyers and that kind of thing. And interest groups can sort of subsidize the cost of that to try to make sure that the interest groups' goals and interests are promoted in legal challenges. One organization that does this a lot is called the American Civil Liberties Union. And on their website, they want your money. On their website, you can get information about cases that they are sponsoring or that they are participating in to try to get laws changed or to try to get policies overturned. And you can see that if you go to their website. They're concerned with mostly Bill of Rights kinds of issues like free speech and freedom of religion and that kind of thing. And so you can see cases that they've sponsored regarding things like immigration and that kind of stuff. I think your book talks about that a little bit as well. A second positive aspect of interest groups is an education or information providing benefit. So almost every organization has an interest in making sure that not only that politicians understand what their concerns are, but also that the public understands what their concerns are so that they can get you to be involved in their interest groups, so they can get you to give them money so they can continue to lobby members of Congress, etc. This is the National Rifle Association's website. And if you go to their website, this is the part of their website where you can find information about what's going on with regards to gun control and gun control laws in the different states. You can see that this information is obviously biased against gun control legislation. So here we are, California, we're a bad state because we have just instituted some relatively strict gun control laws in the state of California. But you can get all kinds of information from the interest group about what's going on around the issue that you care about. And the National Rifle Association has quite an extensive information page on their website. The third positive aspect of interest groups that your book talks about sort of as a solidary benefit, we can also look at it as the participation benefit. One of the things that interest groups do is, because they're paying attention to what's going on in politics, they will tell you when you should join with others who have a shared goal and participate in the political process by going to a march or by doing a letter writing campaign or by sending an email. There are times at which that's more beneficial than others. So, for example, right before a congressional committee holds a hearing is a really good time for people to send an email or to send a letter or to make a phone call. And interest groups, if you belong to an interest group, they'll send you an update that says, hey, now's the time to get involved. So, for example, this is an environmental organization called the Sierra Club, and they have a section of their website. They want your money too. All of the interest groups want your money. But here's the part of their website where they say, we need your voice. And so tell members of Congress to support a Green New Deal. If you wanted to do that, you could click on that and it would give you information about how you can contact your members of Congress. And here's other environmental issues that they care about and ways for people to take action. And that reinforces that sort of solidary benefit that is discussed in your textbook, where interest groups provide people with an opportunity to join together with people who have a shared goal. And that's a really important reason people join interest groups, is because they want to accomplish something together that they can't accomplish acting on their own. So here's just another example of a fairly recent solidary activity of people going to a march. This was a group of scientists and other people who are interested in promoting scientific accuracy and are concerned and feel threatened by cuts to scientific financing. People who deny climate change are a threat to the scientific community. When people in the scientific community hear people say that science can't be trusted or that kind of thing, it causes some concern. And so you don't often see groups of scientists leaving their laboratories and going out for a march. This is an example from the last couple of years where that has happened. So there are some positive aspects of interest groups, and they do provide us with a way of interacting with politics that would be more difficult for us to do if interest groups weren't there to help represent our interests in the policymaking process. But there are some limits to pluralism that I wanted to talk about as well. And the two that are most commonly talked about are what we call collective action problems and free rider problems. They sort of go hand in hand. So these cartoons are intended to illustrate that. A collective action problem is a problem with mobilizing large groups of people. The more people who could potentially join a group, the less likely it's going to be that all of those people will join the group. The smaller and more intensely focused a group is, the easier it is to get everybody to join the group. So, as an example, it would be very difficult to mobilize all people who drink milk or eat cheese. So, dairy consumers, because there are so many dairy consumers, it would be virtually impossible to get all dairy consumers to join an interest group promoting the interests of keeping the cost of dairy low, in part because there's just so many, and it's very difficult to organize large groups of people. But it's not that difficult to mobilize smaller groups of people. So, for example, dairy farmers are very well organized. They see it as a direct economic benefit to them to make sure that they get subsidies, that they aren't overly regulated by the government. So even though we pay maybe a little bit more for our milk and cheese because dairy farmers get subsidized by the government, or there are government policies that are designed to make sure that the dairy industry survives, and maybe that results in us paying a little bit more for milk and cheese, dairy consumers are less likely to mobilize than dairy producers. The other thing that goes hand in hand with collective action problems is that the larger your potential group, the more likely you're going to have what's called a free rider problem. And a free rider problem is the tendency of people to either join an organization for a selective benefit that they might get or a material benefit that they might get, but they join the organization but then never contribute to the organization's success. So, for example, if you join the Sierra Club because they offer you a backpack, if you join, that would be a selective benefit or a material benefit, but then you don't participate in the letter writing campaign, or you don't go to the march if they organize a march or something like that, then technically that's part of what we call the free rider problem. One organization that suffers from a pretty serious free rider problem is National Public Radio, or this link would take you to Sacramento's version of Capital Public Radio. If you listen to public radio, so if you listen to any of the shows that are on public radio, like Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, or any of the NPR news broadcasts, but you don't join Capital Public Radio, then you're a free rider. Right? You can just turn on your radio and listen to Capital Public Radio. There isn't anything they can do to stop you from doing that. But if you don't contribute by joining Capital Public Radio, then technically you're a free rider. Free rider problems are really common in large groups, and it can be difficult to get people to join the group in the first place, and difficult to get them to participate in group activities. And that's one of the reasons potentially really large groups, especially groups that offer what are called collective benefits that you can get whether you join the group or not, are called collective benefits. So, for example, clean air is a collective benefit. Public radio is a collective benefit. You don't have to join the Sierra Club to breathe cleaner air, even though the Sierra Club will fight for clean air legislation. You don't have to join National Public Radio or Capital Public Radio to listen to Capital Public Radio. You can listen whether you join or not. It's a collective benefit. Everybody can benefit from that without joining the group. But groups that offer collective benefits often have to take some of the money that they get from the people who join the group and use that money to purchase material benefits to give people as an enticement to get them to join. So, for example, if you go to the National Wildlife Federation, right, protecting America's wildlife is a collective benefit. Everybody gets to be happy that there are polar bears in the world. That's a collective benefit. But not everybody's going to join the National Wildlife Federation. And so what they have to do is they have to offer you some sort of enticement in the form of what we call a selective benefit in poli-sci speak. Your book actually refers to it as a material benefit. We have a more formal word for it in poli-sci. It's called a selective benefit. Organizations that do not offer just a collective benefit don't have to do that. So the Dairymen's Association, they're an economic interest group. The members who join the Dairymen's Association, well, they're getting an economic benefit. They're getting protection of their industry or favorable legislation for their industry. And so they're going to join without getting a stuffed cow or something from the Dairymen's Association. But free rider problems and collective action problems are really, they're problems of pluralism, because if you think of what pluralism is, it's a theory that says politicians respond to the demands of people who are mobilized. Well, if your group is potentially really big, but you can't mobilize a really, really large number of those people, then politicians aren't going to be as likely to listen to that group because they don't have as many members as they could have. So this slide says you've got a group of cars. This is a collective action problem of getting people to carpool. If only other people would carpool or take public transportation, I would get to work so much more quickly. Well, if everybody is saying that and nobody is taking the bus and nobody is making use of public transportation, then of course the freeways are going to be crowded with cars. That's a collective action problem. And here you've got Mr. Smithers being the ultimate free rider. He's actually taking a free ride from his employee and not helping pedal that bike or get anybody to work. So that's my spiel on interest groups. I hope this presentation helps give you the information, some information about interest groups in a slightly different way than it's talked about in your textbook. And I will talk to you all later.